Bob's Pub in San Francisco, August the 16th to the 18th, and in Vienna, Virginia, on August the 25th. Would you welcome, and quickly, Jerry Seinfeld.
Johnny Carson was the undisputed king of late-night television. For 30 years, his wit, charm, and seemingly effortless ability to make America laugh every night made him not just a host, but a cultural institution. If you were a comedian in the 1970s or 1980s, there was only one gatekeeper who truly mattered: Johnny Carson. A single appearance on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson could transform an unknown comic into a household name overnight. But while Carson was known to boost the careers of some, he could also be cold, dismissive, and even brutal if he didn't believe in you. That's why when whispers began to circulate that Johnny Carson had a particular distaste for Jerry Seinfeld, a man who would later become one of the most successful comedians in history, people were shocked. Carson seemed to embrace everyone, yet when it came to Seinfeld, something was different. And now, looking back, the reasons for that bitterness have become much clearer. Jerry Seinfeld's rise was anything but typical. Born in Brooklyn and raised in Massapequa, Long Island, Jerry gravitated toward comedy not because of flashy charisma or outrageous storytelling, but because of his sharp eye for detail. His humor wasn't about politics, vulgarity, or pushing boundaries the way so many comedians of his generation did. Instead, he obsessed over the mundane. Why do we button the second button on a shirt? Why do airplane peanuts come in such small bags? This brand of observational comedy was clean, relatable, and almost childlike in its simplicity. It was the kind of humor anyone could laugh at, but not everyone respected. For Carson, who had come up in an era where comics had to claw their way through smoky nightclubs and deliver setup punchline after setup punchline with precise timing, Jerry's stripped-down style felt thin. On stage, Jerry didn't project warmth or connection. He delivered his material almost like a machine, sharp, efficient, and a little distant. Still, Carson knew talent when he saw it. Jerry got his first Tonight Show booking in 1981, a dream come true for any young comic. He stepped onto that famous stage, delivered his carefully honed jokes, and won over the audience. By all measures, it was a success. But then came the moment every comic dreamed of. Would Johnny call him over to the couch? That invitation was more than a courtesy. It was the ultimate endorsement, Carson's way of saying, "You've arrived. You belong." That night, Jerry didn't get the nod. Carson smiled politely, clapped with the crowd, and ended the segment. For Jerry, it was crushing. For the comedy world, it was telling. Something about Seinfeld hadn't impressed the king. Behind the scenes, Carson reportedly found Jerry's comedy lacking. He thought it was lightweight, too safe, too clinical. Carson loved comics with a bit of danger, unpredictability, or emotional resonance. People like George Carlin, Richard Pryor, or Rodney Dangerfield. Those were comics who bled on stage, who risked everything for a laugh. Jerry, by comparison, seemed sterile. He didn't curse, didn't rant, didn't expose his soul. He was a technician of comedy, not an artist of pain. In Carson's eyes, that made him a lightweight, and when Carson felt someone was overrated, he rarely hid it. Over the years, Jerry returned to The Tonight Show. He got polite applause, solid laughs, and continued bookings, but Carson's warmth was never there. Other comics noticed. They saw how Carson would light up when someone like Robin Williams sat down, laughing uncontrollably, giving them freedom to riff. With Jerry, the energy stayed cold, controlled, and transactional. Producers sometimes pushed Carson to give Seinfeld more shine, but he resisted. Jerry may have been a competent comic, but he wasn't Carson's guy. And Carson's approval mattered more than most audiences ever knew. The tension between the two only deepened once Jerry found success outside of Carson's reach. In 1989, NBC gave Seinfeld his own sitcom, a move that baffled some in the industry. The pilot struggled, the ratings were mediocre, and even NBC executives considered scrapping it. But slowly, Seinfeld gained traction. By the early 1990s, it had exploded into a phenomenon, redefining sitcom comedy and making Jerry one of the most famous names in America. All of this happened without Carson's blessing. In fact, Carson was quietly irritated that Seinfeld had become such a giant without ever needing him. For decades, Carson had been the kingmaker. If he didn't anoint you, you didn't make it. But Jerry had broken the rules, building an empire outside Carson's control. that bruised Carson's ego in ways few people recognized at the time. And then came the personal differences. Carson was many things: aloof, private, even icy. But he valued class and subtlety. He didn't flaunt wealth. He didn't chase publicity. He lived modestly despite being one of the richest entertainers in the world. Jerry, on the other hand, leaned into his success. As Seinfeld the show turned him into one of the highest-paid comedians alive, Jerry bought luxury cars, mansions, and lived openly as a celebrity billionaire. To Carson, that was tacky. Worse, Jerry's personal life stirred whispers. In the early 1990s, Jerry dated Shoshana Lonstein, a teenager nearly 20 years younger than him. It became tabloid fodder, raising eyebrows even in a less sensitive era. Carson, who valued discretion above all else, reportedly found this disgraceful. He already thought Jerry was arrogant. Now he thought he was reckless too. But the clash wasn't just about lifestyle. It was about philosophy. Seinfeld built his comedy on avoiding sentimentality. He bragged about never doing serious moments, never crying, never letting real vulnerability seep into his work. He once admitted that he hated when sitcoms tried to teach lessons or tug at heartstrings. Carson, meanwhile, had made a career out of balancing humor with humanity. On The Tonight Show, guests cried, revealed personal struggles, and felt safe opening up under Johnny's watch. He believed comedy was not just about laughs, but about connection. To him, Jerry's no hugging, no learning philosophy wasn't clever. It was shallow. He felt Jerry had reduced the art of comedy to mechanical joke-telling, stripping away the heart. Things got even more personal when Jerry began openly mocking the late-night talk show format, the very foundation of Carson's legacy. In interviews, Jerry once described talk shows as phony, criticizing the staged banter and predictable structure. This was a direct shot at Carson, the man who had perfected that very format. To Carson, it was unforgivable arrogance. Here was a man who had never mastered late night, belittling the medium that Carson had spent his life elevating. As time went on, Carson's distance from Seinfeld only grew. When Carson retired in 1992, he largely disappeared from the public eye. He would occasionally write jokes for David Letterman, or quietly support comedians he admired, but he never acknowledged Seinfeld's success. Even as Jerry became the highest-paid comedian on television, Carson never offered public praise. Behind closed doors, insiders whispered that Johnny thought Jerry was phony and smug. For a man who rarely wasted words, those were brutal judgments. What made the divide starker was Carson's treatment of other comics. He adored Norm Macdonald, the Weekend Update anchor on Saturday Night Live, who was sharp, sarcastic, and unpredictable. Norm often cited Carson as his hero, and Johnny returned the admiration. Carson even stayed in touch with Norm after retirement, quietly supporting him. When Norm died in 2021, tributes poured in from across the comedy world, except from Jerry Seinfeld, who stayed noticeably silent. That silence didn't go unnoticed. Fans who had admired both men felt Jerry's absence spoke volumes. To them, it reinforced Carson's long-ago judgment. Jerry was too self-involved to honor anyone but himself. In the end, the tension between Carson and Seinfeld was about more than comedy. It was about two men representing two eras of entertainment. Carson symbolized tradition, polish, and emotional connection. Jerry embodied a new wave of comedy that rejected sentimentality, prioritized cynicism, and treated entertainment as a business empire. Carson couldn't stand that shift, and Jerry didn't care to win his approval. Theirs was not an explosive feud played out in tabloids or interviews. It was a Cold War defined by silence, distance, and unspoken contempt. Yet the irony is hard to miss. Johnny Carson may have hated Jerry Seinfeld, but Jerry went on to become one of the richest, most influential comedians of all time. His show is still quoted daily. His fortune grows larger every year, and his place in television history is secure. Carson, meanwhile, remains a legend of his own era, beloved by those who remember, but largely unknown to younger generations raised on streaming platforms and sitcom reruns. In some ways, Seinfeld eclipsed Carson, and maybe that was Carson's greatest fear all along, that one day a comic he never respected would become bigger than the system he once controlled. Still, even Jerry couldn't escape Carson's shadow. Every comedian who has ever stood on a late-night stage owes something to Johnny Carson. And even though Carson never gave Jerry the couch, never offered the endorsement, and perhaps never offered even quiet respect, Jerry's career is proof that you can succeed without the king's blessing. You can build your own kingdom, even if the old guard despises you. But that bitterness lingered. Carson never warmed to Seinfeld. He never had to. Because for Johnny Carson, the verdict was already in. Jerry Seinfeld was overrated, shallow, and smug. And for Jerry, that silence from Carson was the one laugh he never got, the only one that truly mattered. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this story isn't just what Carson thought of Seinfeld during their lifetimes. It's how their reputations have aged. Carson's era was built on live television, fleeting moments, and the magic of broadcast. You had to be there, tuned in at 11:30 every night to feel his impact. For 3 decades, he owned America's bedtime ritual. Yet the tragedy of Carson's legacy is that his work exists mostly in memory. Clips survive, of course, but the experience of The Tonight Show was about the communal act of watching it live. By contrast, Seinfeld's genius was immortalized in reruns, DVDs, and later streaming. His comedy was built to last, to be dissected endlessly by new generations who weren't even alive when the episodes first aired. And in that sense, Jerry won a kind of immortality that Carson never anticipated. It wasn't just that Jerry didn't need Johnny to succeed, it's that Jerry's comedy transcended Johnny's entire medium. For Carson, that must have been difficult to stomach. He had spent years as the gatekeeper, the arbiter of taste. But by the 1990s, audiences didn't need Carson to tell them who was funny anymore. They had cable, sitcoms, and soon, the internet. Seinfeld represented the death of the old order, the rise of comedy that lived beyond the late-night desk. Carson, who had once feared losing relevance, saw it happening in real time, and the poster child of that shift was Jerry Seinfeld. Perhaps that explains the quiet venom, the refusal to offer even a hint of approval. For Johnny, acknowledging Jerry's genius would have meant acknowledging that the world had moved on without him. And yet there's a strange irony in all of this. For all of Carson's criticisms, Jerry built his empire on the very foundation Johnny had laid. The clean timing, the respect for structure, the ability to land a punchline with precision, all of that came from watching Carson's generation of comics. Jerry might have mocked the late-night format, but he owed his early exposure, his discipline, and even his obsession with craft to the culture Carson had created. Without Johnny Carson, there is no Jerry Seinfeld. And without Jerry Seinfeld, modern comedy looks very different. It's a strange loop of legacy, rivalry, and resentment that neither man ever fully acknowledged. Today, looking back, it's clear that Carson and Seinfeld were two sides of the same coin. One represented the golden age of television, the other the cynical new era of sitcoms and streaming. Carson craved connection. Jerry avoided it. Carson valued humility. Jerry flaunted his success. Carson believed comedy needed humanity. Jerry believed comedy should be pure detachment. They were destined to clash, not because of personal animosity alone, but because they symbolized different visions of what comedy was supposed to be. And that clash, silent though it was, reshaped the comedy world forever.